today who are participating in this, this event. Without further ado, I'd like to begin the first substantive session. And for this session, we're joined by Mr. Richard Lennane. Now, when I first knew Richard, he was part of the Australian delegation to the ad hoc group protocol negotiations back in the 1990s. And then eventually he took up a post with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs from 2001 until 2013, when he worked on BWC issues, including serving as the head of the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit in Geneva, when it was created in 2007 through to 2013, or maybe later than that, in fact. But anyway, in the last few years, Richard has worked as an NGO advocate and a civil society platform manager. He's also actually doing some research with us at UNIDIR on BW-related issues. And we're going to ask Richard to provide a brief overview of the current dynamics in the BWC regime. And we're really delighted that he's agreed to do this. Just two quick things before we start. The first is you should feel free to start submitting questions as soon as you want to, using the Q&A function. And the other thing is that we'll take a brief break for a few minutes before 10:30, just to give you a chance to stretch your legs, make a coffee, have a quick smoke, or whatever it is you need to do before we come back. So that leaves us with pretty much more or less half an hour. So with that, Richard, I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Right, thank you, John. Thank you very much for this introduction and for inviting me to speak at this event. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I'm very pleased to be on this panel with some old friends. It's just like old times. I'm going to take 10 minutes to give you a real sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the main issues in the BWC. And to do that, we really have to look at a bit of the history. Don't panic, we're not going to go through this year by year, but to really get a feel for what's going on in the BWC politically now, technically, we need to know what's happened before. If you've looked at the treaty itself, which I recommend you do, it's very short, it's only 4 pages. And in fact, the main articles probably fit on 1 page. So it doesn't take long to get across what's in the treaty. But as you see, it's had, if you see the slide on the screen now, it's had quite a long and interesting history, which we can kind of split up into the history into 3 phases, and then we have the future for the 4th phase coming up. The first phase, starting from entry into force in 1975, we could say was a phase of initial implementation, and that was really marked, among other things, by some pretty serious non-compliance concerns. There were accusations that the Soviet Union at the time, as well as Iraq and some other countries, were not abiding by the prohibitions of the treaty, that they had active biological weapons programs. And this led to a lot of discussion about the fact that the treaty, the BWC, is so simple. It's just basic prohibitions. It doesn't have any verification capacity or machinery or procedures. That's probably the main point of contrast with its more recent sister convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, where in the CWC you have very detailed and elaborate verification procedures with a standing international organization, the OPCW, to do inspections. They have the staff, they have the labs, they have the procedures to verify that treaty. It's not necessarily simple, as we've seen in Syria, but nevertheless, it's there. BWC didn't have that, and because of that, there was no way to very satisfactorily deal with these non-compliance allegations that were coming up in the first 15 years of the treaty. So around the end of the Cold War in 1990, following a decision by a review conference in 1991, and this was also the period, of course, when the CWC was negotiated, the states parties of the BWC spent almost a decade, well, in fact, over a decade, in various stages of negotiations and discussions about strengthening the convention. And this is the famous protocol. You've probably heard about this. It's sometimes called the verification protocol. It was always more than that. It's a handy shorthand to call it a verification protocol because it did involve verification provisions. But if you look at the mandate of the group that was established to negotiate the protocol, it was broader than that. The so-called ad hoc group mandate talked about a legally binding, multilateral legally binding instrument to strengthen the convention, including compliance measures, but also other measures. And this is very important because throughout the history of the convention, there's been this kind of tension. And you see this also in the other WMD treaties, the NPT and the Chemical Weapons Convention, between the prohibitions where we're asking, the treaty requires states to give up the option of having these weapons. But that prohibition is balanced with a guarantee, a right to use the associated technology for peaceful purposes. And you'll see this in Article 10 of the BWC, one of the most discussed articles of the treaty, that Article 10 has two parts. One that says that the treaty must be implemented in a way that does not hamper the peaceful use of biological science and technology, and that states must cooperate and help each other. So, and basically share the technology. And this is, of course, a parallel with what we saw in the NPT, which was a slightly older treaty, where parties agree to give up the option of acquiring nuclear weapons, but in return, they are guaranteed access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, to nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Now, obviously, this is very important, and especially for developing countries, countries that are wanting to develop their capacity in these areas, be it nuclear or in biological technology, because they very rightly didn't want to be in a position where they're being, that concern about proliferation of weapons technology is being used to block their access to this technology for peaceful purposes, for their own economic development. It's already sensitive with nuclear technology, of course, but it's even more sensitive for biology because biology is everywhere. It's the basis of medicine. It's the basis of public health. So there's a great deal of quite understandable political sensitivity about restricting access to vaccines, to the technology to make vaccines, for example, to restricting access to diagnostic equipment and so on. So this was the deal in the early 1990s. Yes, the states parties agreed they'll try to negotiate this protocol to strengthen the convention. It will add verification procedures. It will establish an international organization to run the thing. But there had to be a balance. This protocol would also contain provisions to strengthen the implementation of Article 10, that is to improve cooperation, to help ensure access to biological technology for peaceful purposes. And that was the package. And I think it's very important to understand what's going on in the BWC now, many years later, because it all comes back to this kind of tension between prevention of the proliferation of biological weapons and weapons technology. And this is Article 3 of the BWC, saying you must not assist or help or transfer biological weapons to anyone else or help them to make them. And that's the justification for, oops, I'm getting some echo here. That's the justification for imposing national export controls, for example. But that's in a kind of tension with Article 10, which is guaranteeing the access for peaceful purposes. So these debates went all throughout the protocol negotiations, trying to get this balance right. How should verification work? There were many other issues mixed up in there. And as you've probably heard, it all came to a horrible, sticky end in 2001, when the United States, with the new Bush administration, abruptly pulled out of those negotiations, said that the BWC could not be verified in this fashion. US copped all the blame for this, some of it fairly, but there were a lot of other problems going on behind the scenes in those negotiations. And I think a number of other countries were quite relieved that the US pulled the plug and took all the blame, and they could quietly get away with not having a protocol. Nevertheless, there was a lot of unhappiness at the time. A lot of work, many years of work had been put into this draft protocol. So a lot of disappointment, a lot of unhappiness, recrimination against the United States, and concern also, I think, from, I think a lot of Western countries were very unhappy because they had invested a lot in developing this protocol. And a lot of the countries from the non-aligned movement were also very upset and concerned, partly because they also wanted verification provisions. but also they saw then the loss of a more organized effort, structured effort to implement Article 10. And they were concerned that this was now be dropped completely, and that other things that would be done on the verification side and Article 10 would just once again be sort of swept under the carpet or forgotten about. So a lot of very unhappy times around 2001, 2002, the Fifth Review Conference. But coincidentally, at that time was also the time of the 9/11, September 11 terrorist attacks in the United States, which was followed very quickly by the anthrax letters incidents. I don't know if you recall that, some bioterrorist incident in the United States, also very disruptive. And this not panicked, but made a lot of governments very concerned. And it really helped solve some of these divisions over the protocol, because this new concern, or enhanced or very sudden concern about the possibility of terrorists or non-state actors acquiring biological weapons, meant that all governments were pretty much on the same side. I mean, this was a concern for everybody, wherever you were on the political spectrum with respect to other BWC issues. Bioterrorism was something that worried everyone. And this really enabled then the start of the third phase, which is the intersessional work program, which has continued ever since with an interruption or two. And this was established by the resumed Fifth Review Conference in 2002. And it was based on this idea that there's many things that can be done to improve implementation of the BWC in the interests of all the states parties that don't need legally binding instruments to do that. And at first it was seen as just a sort of rescue package, after this big political crisis. Here is something we can do to work together and just to, keep the convention ticking over until times improve. But actually, because of this concern, mainly because of this concern of bioterrorism, it proved to be very productive, this first cycle of the intersessional work program between 2003 and 2006. And it turned out that many states parties were very interested in improving their national implementation and strengthening the barriers against bioterrorism, looking at other ways to improve the implementation of the BWC, improving disease surveillance, capacity building. And it really helped dissolve a bit of this tension between Article 3 and Article 10, because instead of seeing it as a trade-off or a competition, slowly this idea came out that actually these two articles can be mutually supportive. And at the 2006 review conference, which is a very important conference when the ISU was established, and then really the convention started to get back on its feet, Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, came and spoke at the opening session, and he said, this is a very important development. They've understood, states parties have understood that investing in Article 10 for Western, he didn't say it quite like this, but the message was, Western countries investing in Article 10 in cooperation and capacity building in developing countries, sharing technology, can help the security objectives of the convention by improving the capacity of other countries to track disease, to secure laboratories, to train their staff, and so on. Conversely, developing countries taking their security obligations very seriously helps give confidence to share technology and do more on Article 10. So it's kind of this mutually reinforcing circle. It didn't get rid of all the tensions, and as we'll see, they're still very much there. So that's kind of where we are now. We've gone through several cycles of this intersessional work program, and I'm going to have to stop in a minute. What's next? So if we just go to the next slide, please, Letitia. Thank you. This is how I see very, very briefly the main issues. The protocol, as I explained, still some unfinished business there. There's still many states parties who understandably, and this is both Western countries and non-aligned countries, who would like to see some kind of legally binding, multilaterally negotiated instrument that would do something about compliance, monitoring, or verification for the BWC. Opinions vary about how that should relate to Article 10, so on, but that's the second big issue there. Article 10, what do we do about that? For many non-aligned countries, this remains a very high priority, understandably, and we've had calls over the years for a mechanism to implement Article 10, some sort of cooperation committee, but this was to be part of the protocol. So you can see when I say many entangled issues, it's all mixed up there. So one way to deal with Article 10 would be to look again at some sort of multilaterally negotiated instrument to strengthen the convention as a whole, not just verification, but Article 10.2 and other things, which links to the third issue, review of science and technology. This has been talked about for a long time. Obviously, scientific and technological developments are very relevant to effective implementation of the convention. They have positive implications, they have negative implications. States parties need to understand what's going on and what it means. And there have been many proposals over the past 10, 15 years for some sort of scientific advisory board, analogous to what we have in the OPCW in The Hague, or some other form of body or system or mechanism to review science and technology. Nobody opposes this in principle. The problem is nobody can quite agree on how it should work and the details. And I think the problem there just hasn't been enough of a priority to overcome sort of natural differences in multilateral negotiation about, oh, we want to do it this way, no, we want to do it this way, no, we can't agree, never mind. So that's still there, and I think that'll be a big issue for the forthcoming review conference. Then there's the issue of institutional support, the ISU. I mean, the BWC has always been the kind of poor stepsister of the big treaties because it doesn't have an international organization. There's no IEA, there's no OPCW for biology. We have the implementation support units, which I think has, if I say so myself, been quite successful in meeting a need. And enjoys, I think, a very good reputation among states parties as being a helpful and economic function. But obviously, it's much less it can do compared to the OPCW in terms of helping states parties implement the convention. And this is something else then coming back to the protocol. The protocol would have established an international organization, something that I think is very much lacking, not just for verification, but for implementing all the other aspects of the convention too. So that question of institutional support and how to develop that, I think, is very much a key issue. So I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions. Of course, I cannot hope to do justice to these issues in this short time. Neither can I hope to be completely impartial. I've tried my best to give you an overview of the different political perspectives. But if you think I've got that wrong, please say so and tell us how you see it. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Richard. You went slightly over time, but I think that was very informative, so it was worth it. I don't see any questions up yet, but I certainly have some questions now that I've got the opportunity. So let me fire two at you, Richard, and see what you think of these. So one of them is, you sort of mentioned the importance of some of these sort of outside or exogenous events, and the impact on the BWC regime. And one in particular you mentioned was, the 2001, the 9/11 attacks and the anthrax, things that happened soon after that. So I guess that sort of begs the question in terms of the dynamics of the BWC. I mean, what kind of influence the COVID pandemic might have on the dynamics of the BWC, with a review conference coming up next year, with the world hopefully by then coming out of a pandemic, thanks to mass vaccination. What might the sort of impact be? And then the other question I had was really, if you were advising the leaders of some of the sort of most influential states in the BWC, let's say for, hypothetical state, you were advising the governments of the three depositories, the United States, which has just undergone a change of government or is in the process of doing that, the UK and the Russians. What would you recommend that they do as depositories if they were trying to sort of, develop or encourage others to develop the convention in some way, or the process? What would the priorities be, do you think? So there's two questions to start you off.
Two good questions.
And I would just encourage people, just before you start, Dickie, Richard, to use the Q&A function if you want to post a question, which is the icon in front of you, sort of more or less in the middle of the screen at the bottom. If you use your mouse, sometimes these icons are hidden, but if you move your mouse, then they should become visible on the screen. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, John. And you can call me Dickie. Anyone can call me Dickie if they wish.
I do. I get confused.
All right. Yeah, two good questions. I think on the first one, COVID obviously I think will be the most important exogenous or sort of outside development since 9/11 to affect the convention. I think a lot of people are watching to see what will happen. To me, I see it mostly as an opportunity. Obviously, there may be some questions. There have been rumors and mutterings about, was COVID a deliberate event? Was it a leak from a biolab in China? There doesn't seem to be any specific evidence for that, but maybe someone will bring that question up, which could get a little bit politically delicate. But I think by far the most important aspect of COVID is that it brings attention to the importance of the BWC and reminds everyone why we're all here. COVID was probably most likely a naturally occurring outbreak, but if it hadn't been, it really illustrates what we're potentially up against with biological weapons and why a multilateral treaty like the BWC is so important and why we need to be ready. And we need to have procedures and we need to have capacity, national capacity, international capacity. And we need to take these things seriously. Just to give a small example, this review of science and technology. As I say, no big disagreements in principle, but I just think states parties really haven't given it enough of a priority to overcome their sort of small differences on procedures and mechanisms. And what I'm hoping is that COVID will sort of really push the whole BWC up the political scale a bit and give it a bit more high-level attention in capitals. So, okay, this is not something we can just leave to be talked about every few years, and then if we don't agree, then we just say never mind and come back next time. We need to fix this, and we need, we can't be perfect. We can't make everything. We can't suddenly invent a new protocol, but we need to do something, and it needs to put us into a position where we're able to respond to something like COVID, should that occur. That links to the second question, advice for the 3 depositories, for example, or for other key governments, make this a priority. I mean, I think the depositories, since you mentioned them, have a very important role in making high-level contacts with other states parties and say, look, we know there are many other things going on in the world, lots of other difficult issues, but this is important. COVID shows us how important it is. Please make this review conference a priority. Please prepare your positions. Get your experts in touch with their colleagues in other states parties. Start working on proposals. Consult, work together, and I think if the depositories can make a pretty consistent message, like not just a single démarche or something, but to keep putting this on the agenda, to push it up that list of national priorities, I think that would be a huge contribution.
Thanks very much, Richard. Those are, I think, really helpful answers. We're starting to get some questions in. They're very good questions, actually. I'm going to roll a couple of them together into one, and then ask you the other one. So there are a couple of them concern the protocol and verification, and the first part of the first question is if you could maybe tell us a little more about what the protocol had foreseen in terms of verification. And, what you think in your view, and Richard, you're quite an authority on this. I remember the ad hoc group days, and you did some very substantive work in terms of developing aspects of the protocol draft. What you would see now as sort of, potentially doable. And if a sort of protocol style arrangement isn't going to be possible in the future, what would you see sort of as potential alternatives to that? And then the other question is, if you imagine a future institution for the BWC, what model would you use? Would it need a new model, or could an existing one like the OPCW or the IAEA or the Technical Secretariat to the CTBT, would one of those sort of be a viable model, or would it need some reinvention?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great questions. What was foreseen in the protocol? It was really, I could talk for hours about this, but it was really, I think, pretty similar in concept to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So things were given different names and sort of shifted around a bit to suit biological technology rather than chemistry. But it was the same idea. There'd be some sort of regular routine inspections or visits, we call them, to biotechnology facilities. There would be provision to investigate allegations, either of alleged use or of alleged production or misuse of facilities. There would be provision very similar to the Chemical Weapons Convention for declaring facilities. So each country would submit national declarations of various categories of biological facilities, for example, high containment laboratories or maximum containment laboratories. And a lot of the negotiation of those years was about exactly, what should be captured by these declarations, what should be declared. And I think, and that's on the verification side. As I mentioned before, there were also provisions to strengthen cooperation, Article 10, assistance, capacity building, and so on. And questions about what to do. There's a very knotty question about transfers and export controls, which I don't think was actually solved in the draft, but it was there. That's what was foreseen. What would you do now? I think history has proved that perhaps that approach was not terribly, would not have been terribly effective because of the way biotechnology and the biological industry has exploded all over the world. And that's really just a sort of logistical and financial thing, whereas, the IEA has to keep track of about 1,000 nuclear facilities worldwide that are judged to be some way relevant to nuclear fuel, nuclear weapons production. OPCW, I think, if you look at all the different categories, they track at maybe 5,000, between 5,000 and 10,000 chemical facilities, including the what they call discrete organic chemical production facilities. But if you look in biology and labs or facilities that are somehow capable of being involved in biological weapons production, you go into hundreds of thousands very quickly, and probably today millions, because everything's got smaller, cheaper. This was already a phenomenon at the time of negotiations. It's only accelerated since. So now, what are you going to be tracking? What are you going to be inspecting? The technology is everywhere. You can buy it on the internet. You can set yourself up a little lab at home and make stuff that 30 years ago you would have needed a very expensive university laboratory to do. So that's the question, what now? I think personally, my big disappointment with the way the BWC meetings and discussion has evolved over the past few years is it's been very sterile in terms of we should have a protocol, no, we shouldn't, yes, we should, no, we shouldn't, without really pulling apart, okay, if you did have a protocol or something, what would it involve and what could it deliver? And I'm really hoping that we can move beyond this kind of yes, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong kind of debate and say, okay, let's explore what could you do to strengthen the convention now? Knowing what we know now, 20 years later, about the way the technology works and is being employed, what would you do? And I don't know, by the way, this is for participants to discuss. But, the explosion technology also offers a lot of possibility for new verification techniques. It's not a matter maybe of sending inspectors in protective gear to a physical factory. There may be other approaches. Future institution. I don't think it's terribly complicated. It's really a question of political and financial commitment from states parties. They have to see that greater institutional support is valuable and worth spending serious money on. You look at the budget of the ISU and you look at the budget of for example, the Provisional Technical Secretariat of the CTBTO. I mean, it's hundreds of millions versus about 1 million. And I think until BWC states parties are ready to commit, maybe not hundreds of millions, but certainly tens of millions, we're not going to get very far with institutional support. I think the legal form, structure is probably less important a question. The CTBTO would be a fine model. OPCW, sure. I mean, or some sort of hybrid thing. It really doesn't matter. What matters is the commitment, and we're coming with money and resolve, and we're going to solve this.
Thanks, Richard. This is really interesting, and I've got a couple more questions, and I think probably the two that I've got are all we have before the time we have before the break. But as you were speaking, you were talking about new verification techniques and so forth, and it sort of made me wonder that what kind of role the BWC regime could actually play in terms of sort of standard setting for different things. And one of those things, and it relates to one of the questions here, some time ago, one of my guilty pleasures during lockdown is to watch loads of trashy Netflix. And I was watching the remake of this US sci-fi series Lost in Space. And these guys, they crash on a planet and their spaceship is there, and they want to make a gun to defend themselves. So they go to their 3D printer in their lab, and they go to, they type in, want to make a gun, and, the instructions. And the 3D printer says, I won't make you a gun because it's not authorized. And one of the questions we've got is how can we ensure safety if we can print 3D print guns now? And I think what they mean is, do you think that with biological weapons, we could incorporate sort of authentication into technology that might stop some of the kind of misuse of that? And then I guess by extension, with the standards, is could the BWC conceivably usefully play kind of any role in that? And then sort of tangentially related to that, I think the other question that's come in is, do you think that the BWC is the most efficient way to deal with biological weapons in a post-COVID world? Or would there be other processes and mechanisms that could be more flexible? And I mean, that might be a really good chance maybe to talk about the relationship of the BWC to some of the kind of health and biosafety stuff. And then I think that would take us quite nicely to the break. Over to you, Dickie.
Okay. Yeah, standard. I mean, this personally interests me very much. And when I was working in the ISU, it was really something we tried to explore a little bit, is how you could use some of these technologies. One of the most interesting examples, I think, was from gene synthesis companies. And I don't know what's become of this, but there are companies, for example, which synthesize certain DNA, and you can order this for your biotech production. You order it online, certain sequences. And there's obviously a concern that people might be ordering bad things. And there's also a concern that people might be disguising this fact by ordering things that on their own don't do anything bad, but when you put them together, make something bad. And so this gene synthesis industry group had got together to actually develop a system so they could check that people weren't shopping around to assemble dangerous sequences without them being alerted. And they are working on a system. Obviously, they had to protect their own commercial proprietary interests. They didn't want to give commercial data to their competitors. They couldn't release information about their clients to the competitors. So the challenge was to see what sequences were being ordered and to have some sort of clearinghouse where they could match up the orders with everyone staying anonymous and determine whether there was something suspicious or that needed further attention. So a lot of information processing and sort of IT involved in that. So I mean, that's just one small example, but there are many ways this could be approached. I mean, yes, the 3D printer that refuses to print the gun, I don't know, we get to something analogous to that, but obviously there's a huge potential out there to be explored, and it's not really being explored now, which comes to the second part of it, or second question. Is the BWC the most efficient way? I don't think any sort of UN-based multilateral thing could ever be said to be the most efficient way of doing anything, but it's a necessary way. But I don't think we should at all be sort of posing it as alternatives. I mean, the BWC is something which can encourage and perhaps to some degree coordinate, and if not coordinate, at least stimulate all these other actions by other stakeholders. And that's a very important part of what's been done in the intersessional process, is bringing in these other organizations, these other stakeholder groups, the industry, the biosafety community, the scientific community, to discuss with governments and BWC states parties about what they should be doing. And it's not a matter of the BWC states parties saying, this shall be so, and dispatching orders to the rest of the world. It's a matter of consultation and coordination and building networks and supporting each other and sharing information about what needs to be done. We can't tell you to go and do it. The BWC can't kind of control the world. We say, okay, this is a problem. What can you, the scientific community, you, the biotech industry, what can you, NGOs, and us nationally as states parties, what can we do about that? And how can we better work together? Now, maybe having a protocol or having an instrument or having at least an international organization would really help that process and make it more effective and easier. But it can be done anyway, and it has been being done. Let's hope it will continue. But I think there are big opportunities here to push it up a notch.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. I think that's really, really useful as a way for framing, I think, some of the discussions that we're going to be having over the course of this morning and subsequent sessions. It's a very strong start, and I hope that you'll stick around over the course of the morning and that you'll be prepared perhaps to chip in some of the debates that we're going to have in